So what do we know about intimate relationships and sexual decision-making among young people? If you just read the news or read the blogs, you think that most young people's sexual experiences are outside of intimate relationships. They're hooking up or they're casual sex. If you even read the academic books and journals, you might also think that casual sex and hookups are where sexual decision-making largely occurs. And in terms of whether young women want to have sex, if you just watch the news or read the paper, you would think that there is a lot of stranger rape and that unwanted sex mainly occurs outside of intimate relationships. Today, I want to talk about two questions, and in true sociologist style, they each have 3 and 2 subparts. So first, though, how do intimate relationships structure decisions about whether and when to have penile-vaginal sex? And so here I want to compare women in different kinds of relationships and how they make their decisions. I'll step back a little bit and talk about what are the rules for when you should have sex and when you shouldn't have sex. What enforces those rules? And then within this structure of these rules, do women really have any agency over their sexual experiences, right? Because I'm going to talk a lot about how structure influences this decision-making, but where's the role of women in this decision-making also and what they want? And then second, I want to talk about expectations. So do the intimate relationships that women are in structure their expectations for sex, and especially for unwanted sex, and what do those expectations mean for their experiences with sex? So first, let me tell you about the data. And also, I'm apologize. I'm either going to be coughing or I'm going to have a cough drop in my mouth. I don't know which is worse, but I have asthma and I had COVID a month ago and I cannot stop coughing. So the RDSL, as Jessica mentioned, the Relationship Dynamics and Social Life Study was just funded by a big grant from NICHD, and we collected data, and I'm going to talk about 3 parts today. First, survey data collection. It was a sample of 1,003 young women, ages 18 and 19, and I had that red star there just to remind myself to say that in 2008, when we selected the sample, first of all, being out as a transgender person was much rarer than it is today. And there are 2 reasons why I don't think the young women in my study, I don't think there were any people assigned female at birth who identified as men were in my study. And so I'm going to largely use the word women, although because this talk is really gendered. I try to use gender neutral language, but in this case, it's usually hard to use gender neutral language. In 2008, you could not change the sex on your driver's license from what you were assigned at birth. You can now, but we picked the sample based on driver's license and personal ID records. And then after we selected this random sample, we sent out invitations to participate in a study. And the respondent facing name of the study was not RDSL, but it was the Michigan Study of Young Women. And so I think probably if there were transgender people who were assigned female at birth and identified as men, they probably didn't participate. And also we have spoken to a lot of them, and none of the people we spoke to identified or alerted us that they identified as not women. And we gave them weekly surveys for 2.5 years. And the last question on that survey was, is there anything else you want to tell us? And they told us a lot of stuff. No one ever told us that that they weren't women. They said things like, my partner doesn't have a penis. Why are you asking me these questions about penises? My partners don't fit your questions. So there was kind of related stuff that they told us, but never anything about being transgender. I think if we did the study again today, it might be quite different, especially given the age range. Okay, so 1,003 young women, ages 18 and 19, a county in Michigan, Genesee County. I was at the University of Michigan at the time. Genesee County is about an hour away. I picked this county because it has a good mix. It's a good mix of white and Black racialized population, about a third, 2/3 white, 1/3 racialized Black. And also there's a nice SES mix within both populations. Genesee County is where Flint is, so you might be thinking it's a poor area, but actually it's a big county and there's a lot of variation. Ushia used to live in Genesee County so there's a mix. The baseline survey was a 50-minute face-to-face interview. Among those respondents that we could find, 93% agreed. The overall response rate, like the APOR response rate, was 84%. But among those we could find was 93%. So most of the non-response, I think, was due to outdated lists of people due to their outdated addresses on lists. Then part 2 was weekly follow-up surveys. So at the end of that 50-minute face-to-face interview, they were invited to participate in this follow-up study that was to last for 2.5 years and to consist of 5-minute brief surveys online or over the phone. Back in 2008, even 2010, 2011, I think the smartphone prevalence was about 15%. So this was not a smartphone study. We ended up with 58,594 weekly surveys. If you're doing the math, 130 weeks times 1,000 respondents, it's about half or a little under half of what we could have gotten. Although there was one overzealous respondent who completed 165 weekly surveys, because we did send out the invitation for the next survey 5 days after you completed the current survey. So she did them every 5 days throughout the study. Mean was about 60, partially because people waited longer than a week to do, in between surveys, and partially because people dropped out over time, of course. Sorry. I have to resort to the cough drops. So 58,000-ish weekly surveys. 952 of those 1,003 women completed at least 2 weekly surveys. Most of my statistics that I do with these data compare 2 weeks within the same woman and how the circumstances of those 2 weeks differed and how that, changed some outcome. Today, I'm going to talk about sex. So I need at least 2 weekly surveys. 75% of them remain in the study for at least 18 months. It's funny because response rates are so difficult now, and they weren't back then. And so a recent reviewer in the Journal of Sex Research said, is there a typo? Because I don't think that's actually possible. So we had nice cooperation. So what did we get in terms of the sample? Basic demographics, like I said, it's about a third Black racialized women and about 2/3 white women, very few Latinos, all of whom identified as Black or white. About a quarter of them were not exclusively heterosexual. I'm not really going to talk about that today, except to say that there were 6 women in the study who identified as lesbians and never had sex with a man. And I do not include them in these statistical models. And I don't think any of them were in-depth interviewees. And we're working on them in sort of a separate project. But I'm not going to really talk about them today. But I'm not ignoring them, I just want to say. Before the study began, about a quarter had already had a pregnancy. 2/3 had had penile-vaginal sex without contraception. A third of them were living with an intimate partner at the baseline. During the study, 884 of them, or 95%, ever had penile-vaginal sex. It's about 17,581 sex weeks. I'll talk about sex weeks across 2,704 unique relationships. And so I consider a partnership, a relationship. Many of them dissolved and reconstituted, but this partner, if you broke up and got back together later, it's connected in this study. So these relationships sometimes had stops and starts. Part 3. So we had the surveys, we had the weekly surveys, and in-depth interviews occurred kind of alongside these weekly surveys. first with 45 women who reported a pregnancy during the study, and it was so cool. Every day I would get this email on my phone listing who changed pregnancy status in the last 24 hours, and you could zip out and interview them. Such a fun, such a good part of the study, my favorite part. Then at the end, we picked 32 respondents who didn't get pregnant during the study, but had high propensity for pregnancy. And what I realized, it's not necessarily high propensity, although we did use a propensity score matching model to choose them. It's really women who were sexually active, had at least some serious relationships, and were not did not use an IUD throughout the entire 2.5 years. So not a particularly weird sample within my sample. And Flint and Genesee County did have lower income than the national average, 2008 to 2012, but not wildly different. Like I think the average income is like 45 or 55,000, and Genesee County is like $8,000 less. It's a little bit blacker and a little bit more religious, and so the stuff that's different about the Black racialized population in the US and the white racialized population in the US, there are some of those differences, including religiosity. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about 8 relationship types that vary weekly. And these are the questions that and then this is like through the whole talk, the core of the talk. I'm going to compare unpartnered people, although largely the unpartnered weeks are not in this analysis, because if you had sex, you were partnered. Even if it was one time with a person you never met before, that is a partner and a relationship. It's not like we're in a relationship kind of relationship, but it's a relationship in that, it's a connection, an intimate connection. So a relationship where the person said the respondent said they did not spend a lot of time together and they were not committed to monogamy, I'm calling a hookup. Sometimes I divide this category into a sexual hookup and a talking kind of hookup. Today I don't, because the dependent variable is sex. So we're calling this a hookup. A casual dating relationship type is when they spend limited time together. Where they spent a lot of time together, but they were not committed to monogamy. Long distance dating, I can call it long distance because a substantial part of these partnerships were people away in the military or working in another state. Sometimes it was frankly just that they didn't see each other that much that week. But so it's limited time together, but committed to monogamy. Committed dating is what you think of as in a relationship. Committed dating, they spent a lot of time together, they were committed to monogamy. Stayovers are committed to monogamy and slept in the same bed at least 3 or more times per week. And that's kind of a key. This is the most sex happens here. Sex happens all over here. Cohabitors actually officially shared an address, and engaged people said that they were engaged to get married, and married people said they were married. And sometimes I combine those two because they use those terms loosely. So sometimes they call this, especially if they're pregnant, they might say, this is my fiance, to demonstrate that it's a real relationship. Sometimes people were married, and when we asked these questions, we referred to, oh, last week you were married to Bob. Are you still married to Bob? And sometimes like, I was never married to Bob. Not that often, but sometimes. So as like an indicator of this is a very serious relationship. Okay, and then I'm also going to talk about 3 methods. This is a lot for one talk. I apologize. So I'm going to talk pretty fast, but please stop me at any time if it's not clear or if you have a question. And if I don't get through it all, it's no big deal. I'm going to talk about the qualitative analysis of in-depth interviews. And here, why I need these in-depth interviews is because I want to hear women's descriptions of how they made decisions about sex. How did you decide whether to have sex with this guy? How did you decide not to have sex with this guy, etc.? Fixed effects models, where 2 kinds of fixed effects models, actually, just so for an exercise, comparing within the same couple, their probability of sex across weeks as their relationship change type. So how does the same 2 people behave in different circumstances? And also, because I don't have weekly data about sexual desires or expectations, how did women, within woman, how did her desires and expectations change across her different relationships? And then also latent class analysis, where I want to describe the context of those 17,600 weeks, those sex weeks. Like, what were the other things going on in that week? What was the sexual scenario? That's what I'm going to call those. So back to my two questions. So first, what are the rules for about whether and how you decide whether you're going to have sex with this particular partner? What are the rules? So I want to draw on three broad ideas about decision making and apply them to sex. So Giddens and Sewell define structure as a combination of cultural schemas about how something should be, like these non-conscious shared understandings of how the world works, right? Plus resources. So something that enables those schemas, something that gives it teeth, right? That's my dog. These are the rules for sex. So we have these shared understandings about how sex works and when you're supposed to have sex and when you're not supposed to have sex, right? So, for example, anyway, that's why I have notes, so I don't talk too much about any one thing. Symbolic interactionists and Goffman say that schemas themselves are resources in decision-making, right? If everyone knows the rules, we have all these shared understandings, then this makes everything less awkward, right? If you know how it's supposed to go down, you don't have to discuss everything. And so in terms of sex, if you're leaving at the bar with someone after a night of drinking and flirting, if we all understand that this is about, this is the pathway to sex, we don't have to have those very awkward conversations about whether to have sex or, consent. So the schemas themselves, these shared understandings are resources, but scripting theory, which developed, largely independent of the symbolic interactionists, posits that behavior is socioculturally patterned, and these patterns are called scripts. So very related. And then Simon and Gagnon in sexual scripting theory say that these same cultural schemas inform the sexual scripts that tell us, what our role is to play in every scenario. So, okay, so what were the rules? What are the rules for sex? It's funny, I was trying to try out this idea on my husband, and I'm like, honey, what are the rules about when you're supposed to have sex and when you're not? He's like, consent? No clue. So we decided against what are you guys telling me? What are the rules? Historically, the rules about sex are that if you're not married, you can't have sex, right? This is not, to say that no sex happened outside of marriage, right? But this is just the rule. You could break the rules, but this was the rule. No marriage, no sex. It's a form of gatekeeping, right? Where you're supposed to wait, and marriage is the gate, right? So you wait until you're married, and then it's okay to have sex. But what about the deinstitutionalization of marriage, right? What about Cherlin? Does this schema for sex and marriage, does it still have any teeth? Is it still relevant at all? So you may be surprised to know that only 29% of Americans think that casual sex between consenting adults is always okay. Americans are not liberal about sex. 80% of people believe that people who want children should get married. So marriage is not the normative setting for sex. Let's be clear, right? So most sex happens, or most first sex happens outside of marriage. And marriage is no longer even the normative setting to some degree for childbearing, right? But 75% or more of Americans think sex is wrong for unmarried 16-year-olds. So that's very widespread belief that sex is wrong for young people. And that's a matter of maturity, right? Most non-marital births are to cohabiting couples, right? Not just any couples. It's not okay to be, have kids in any kind of relationship. You still need to be co-resident. So there's pieces of marriage that this connection between marriage and sex and pregnancy persist. Pieces of this story persist. Maturity, co-residence. So did women draw on these schemas, these shared understandings about the way sex should be in their sexual decision-making? And yes, they did. So you won't be surprised by this, but I think some people might be surprised by this being linked to marriage, right? So I argue that this schema about sex and marriage has sort of morphed into a schema about sex in serious relationships. And so Cynthia told me, I'm just choosing not to have sex because it's just, at the end of the day, sex is so easy to find. Oh my God, anybody can get sex. I mean, come on. I want a relationship with somebody. So I'm going to actually like not having sex with these guys. We're just talking. So searching for the guy who would actually commit, she had definitely sexual experiences before, but she was waiting for something, you know, more serious, more better, something better. Brittany told me that she really wanted to wait until she was married to have sex, but she told me about her current boyfriend at the time, when he let me move in with him and showed me that he wasn't just trying to get into my pants. So there is this gatekeeping element throughout these stories. Maria told me, non-judgmentally explaining why a past partner had broken up with her, and she agreed that he should break up with her. I think mainly that was the reason why we ended up drifting apart, because he felt like we were supposed to have penile-vaginal sex, and I told him I wasn't ready. So after that conversation, that's when we really started drifting apart from each other. So, serious relationships and sex. Women also had the strongest desire for sex when they were married or in married-like relationships. And so these are those fixed effects models comparing different relationships for a woman. So let me walk you through the graph a little bit. So it's showing you the level of desire, which ranges from 0 to 5 for a woman across her different relationships that were, you know, comprised of different percentages of these types, basically. So the predicted level of desire is on the y-axis, and it goes from 0 to 5. It's from this fixed effects model. The relationship types are across the x-axis, and there's roughly 3 groups here. Group of relationships that included high or strong desire for sex, a group of relationships that included moderate desire for sex, and a relationship that included weak desire for sex, right? So it's the, you know, where the cutoffs are. There's definitely big differences between the beginning and the end. There's some messiness in the middle, but so I'm not sure where to put these stayovers, but these people are clearly stronger desire than these people. And then again, with this casual dating kind of giant standard error, just because there's not that much casual dating. Yeah.
Do you know the data if people who are married, if how many sexual partners they had, or if this was their first?
So in a separate analysis, I have discovered with sequence analysis that there's sort of 2 groups of married people in the study. One group that's been stably married through the entire study, and another group that either enters marriage or departs marriage. And so they're quite different. The people who were stably married through the entire study have on average 2 partners, less than 2 partners, like 1.58 or something.
It wasn't like they waited to get married.
So what? Sorry.
So it wasn't like they waited to get married to have sex. I mean, it may have been, some of them may have been, but some of them.
So these married people, I don't know. I haven't really completely wrapped my head around it. I will say those 2 groups are quite different. So some of this marriage is unstable, and some of this marriage is high school sweethearts who got married after high school and stayed married throughout the study period. Okay, so the next question, what enforces these rules about relationships and sex? Well, so the question is, what's the power behind of these rules? What enforces this schema or these rules about sex? Well, we'll go back to marriage. Marriage is and always has been patriarchal. And by patriarchal, I just mean that men's desires and interests sort of trump women's, right? So no pun intended. So in the not very distant past, in the recent past, wives were property. Women weren't allowed to have bank accounts. Women consented to have sex on demand in perpetuity with their husband when they got married. Marital rape was not a thing in my lifetime. So these are not really old rules. There is this unspoken agreement that many scholars have written about that entitles men in marriage to male dominance, and that includes violence. What about now? So there's a very recent paper by Jacqueline Wong and I think Gender and Society that even in spite of everyone's talking about equality, right? We know that what men want still comes first, and that the new kind of unspoken agreement is among couples who prefer equality, that it prioritizing the husband's career interests and wives' parenting is beneficial for the whole family, right? So this is the new bargain among people who prefer equality. And what about dating? And so that's about career. Gosh, sorry. That's about career decision making. What about how does this apply to sex, right? So are men dominant in dating relationships as we know they are in married relationships? Well, even in dating relationships, the man partner in mixed gender dating relationships, the man partner tends to be older, the woman tends to be younger. Men tend to make more money. Men tend to choose the timing and location of dates. Men tend to pay, and men even tend to initiate hookups. So if you have some idea in your mind that society today is, no, that has been dispelled this week. But if you had any idea in your mind that men and women play equal roles in relationships or dating or sex, it's on average simply not true. But wait, so what does this have to do with sex, right? So dating relationships, men have more power, but what has this have to do with sex? Well, men think about sex and masturbate more than women, even at young ages when desire for sex is high among both men and women. Men's sexual desire is higher than women's. Young heterosexual women's sexual pleasure and orgasm frequency is less than men's. And so none of this is really surprising, right? If you realize that sexual desire is based on expectations for what this experience would entail, it's no surprise that women have less desire for sex than men, because it entails less pleasure for women than it does for men. This is not biological. If you time to orgasm, if you ask women and men to masturbate to orgasm, it takes about the same amount of time to reach orgasm for men and women. So when we're having sex with ourselves, it's no harder for women than it is for men. Women are not inherently less sexual than men. That's a topic for another day. But so let's just suffice it to say that both men and women alike tend to believe that men's desire for sex is stronger than women's. And right, this is learned, this is socially constructed, but it's real. So now the unspoken agreement when it comes to sex is this combination of patriarchy in relationships, and men's sexual desires are higher means men are entitled to sex, right? And they can use force to get it if they need to. So this, I guess I'm going to continue on and just present evidence of this rather than trying to convince you on like a theoretical level. So did women draw on this logic in their decision making? Yes. So illustrating men's desire and men's entitlement to sex, Danielle told me that after she recently had an abortion, her partner said, well, we're not having sex at all for a very long time. The abortion was expensive. It was a hassle. She said to me, I'm like, yeah, I don't see that happening. You're a guy, emphasizing the strength of his desire for sex, right? Katie was 6 days postpartum, and she was telling me about how hard this was for her husband. I mean, it's hard for him. It's hard for him already 6 days later. But I can do it. I don't have a problem with it so far. So far, I'm saying, yeah, I'm going to abstain for 6 weeks. But I don't know. Like emphasizing his desire and entitlement to sex was going to outweigh her doctor's direction to abstain from sex for 6 weeks. She was very sympathetic. You know, men want sex, and it's bad for them if they're denied sex. Kathleen was describing a fight, and it was actually a fight about condom use. And she said, I didn't care enough to fight about it, or not so much fight, but even have a conversation about it. I was more along the lines of, ugh, fine, if I can just get it over and done with. So rather than resist, she acquiesced to this sex rather than start a fight or even have a conversation, because she perceived this as her partner was entitled to this and she was going to have to convince him otherwise. And he felt he was entitled to this. And so just getting it over with was easier. So within this structure, patriarchy, this kind of unspoken agreement about men's desires for sex, do women have any agency? Well, of course they do, right? So it turns out that women had sex within their relationships in a pattern that looks very similar to their desires, right? So they desired sex more in their more serious relationships. They had sex more in their more serious relationships. And so it does seem like they had some agency. We see three kind of similar categories. They're, I think, a little bit clearer here than they were in the desires, but there's three categories. And now let me bring you to the latent class analysis, which is like a lot for one slide, sorry. So let's focus on the first column, and I'll point out that of the 17,600 sex weeks, 12,000 fit in this class, about a little over 2/3 of the sex. I call it highly desired, stable, harmonious relationship sex. Like it's the good, it's like good sex that's desired and expected with decent partners. And its defining characteristic is that fighting and intimate partner violence is super low here. So we'll get to the other categories, but nonviolent fighting was low. I mean, across the study, 26% of these sex weeks and like 75% of the overall partnered weeks, but a quarter of the sex weeks involved fighting, but here only 14%. There was virtually no disrespect and no physical assault, and it largely occurred in relationships that were not volatile. So highly desired, 4.33 on a scale of 0 to 5, harmonious, stable relationship sex, like maybe what we think of as the ideal. So, but yeah, question.
I was wondering, what is latent class?
What is latent class analysis? You can stay after and we can chat about it. But basically, conceptually, it is trying to find clusters of weeks that resemble each other. And so it's telling me there were 3 clusters of kinds of sex, kinds of weeks that resembled each other. This is the first class of sex that seem to form a cluster.
Okay.
It's like latent class analysis is like magic.
Okay.
All good statistical methods, it's magic. But so the stable harmonious relationship sex, I alluded to the fact that their sex was a very frequently part of violence perpetration on women. And so not a lot of the sex was violent, but almost all of the violence was sexual. So 84% of weeks that included physical assault or threats, 84% of those weeks also included penile-vaginal sex. So I don't want to be confusing. I'm not saying like a lot of sex is physically coerced, but when physical assault happens, sex almost always comes with it. And so if we go back to the latent class analysis, the second category, it's not like it's 11% of the sex. It's not no sex, right? All of these things are very high. So the color coding is like red is very low, green is very high. So nonviolent fighting, virtually 100% of these weeks included nonviolent fighting, and also they included fighting kind of regardless of violence. 87% of these weeks included fighting with disrespect. 15% included physical assault, which is the prevalence is 2% in the data set. So 7 times as many of these weeks included assault as in the overall data. Partners cheated, partners controlled decision making. So about 11% of this sex was like the opposite of ideal. Now, note that it did not happen at the beginning of relationships or in short-term relationships. It happened largely in moderately serious or serious relationships. This was not like, you hook up with a guy that turns violent on you and you didn't expect that and it ends up sexual. This is within relationships for the very most part. And that's about 11% of the sex. So 1,860 weeks were characterized by this grouping. Now, if we go back to the fixed effects models, which are much closer to a causal question. So these sexual scenarios are like, what happened? Like, I don't know what caused what, but what tended to co-occur. So if we go to the fixed effects models, this is the same couple week over week. And what was their probability of sex in non-violent weeks and violent weeks? And the probability of sex is like roughly overall 50 or 60%. There's a 4% bump in weeks with fighting, another 4% bump if there was disrespect along with that fighting, and another 6% bump if there was physical assault. So sex, the probability of sex for a couple, for a person, regardless of like, oh my God, it's 40 minutes in and I'm only here. Okay, so so this is not like, there's no experiment here. Like I didn't get someone to be violent and see whether that led to sex, but it's a fixed effects model comparing the same couple in different circumstances and saying that conflict and violence, this probability of sex was much higher alongside conflict and violence than it was without conflict and violence. And sometimes coercion. So let me tell you about Samantha. Samantha was the first in-depth interview I did as part of this project, and really the first in-depth interview I ever did. And what I was like 25 or 27 or something at the time. And she was 18, and this is what she told me. She was at a funeral with her partner was at a funeral. And then he picked her up and they were going to go to the, after funeral thing at someone's house, like a family member's house. And so they went there and his family, a lot of his family was there. And I feel like somewhere I have a bigger version of this story, but okay. So he accused her of flirting with someone at the funeral and he kind of dragged her out of there. And she said, so we go. I'm rocking to the music in the truck. Everything's all good. We go up to this such and such a park. I'm sitting there thinking we're about to get groovy, right? This is her serious boyfriend. They're in the back of the park. It's night. It's dark. He drove her there. This is obviously a sexual setup, right? Or something, back to the park, music's on. Then I didn't know what was happening. This is the first time we actually had a big argument. The first time for everything, meaning the first time he hit her. I'm like, so I'm sitting there thinking, oh no, sorry, I read that. So the first time for everything and he just hit me. I'm like, wait, and he hit me again and hit me again. Nose bleeding. And he was like, yeah, you think I didn't see that? And I'm like, see what? How you were looking at him. And then he was like, if you ever look at another guy like that again. And then she said, you're wrong, buddy, whatever his name was. You're wrong. He knew he was wrong. That's why we wanted to have sex after all that. And I said, well, did you? And she said, yeah, we did. We did. I didn't want to, but he's so big, I can't say no. So most people did not tell me stories about violent sex, but this was a story to me that illustrated these ideas well, because it was an obvious setting for sex. She thought they were going to have sex, that she expected to have sex, but it turned violent. And then, she didn't feel like she could say no, but she also said we wanted to have sex. So it wasn't clear whether this is some kind of ugly form of makeup sex or whether, it was like smoothing over sex because they had been in this argument. So sometimes coercion and violence did go right alongside with sex. So let's summarize so far. Women used gatekeeping logic about relationships to make decisions about sex. Women perceived their male partners to be entitled to sex. They had more sex in serious relationships and alongside violence. But overall desire and experiences were well matched. So the vast majority of sex seems to be agentic sex. So what about how intimate relationships structure women's expectations for whether they get to make these decisions about sex? Go back to social norms about marriage, no sex, right? Gatekeeping, we talked about that, but also, in addition to being proscribed outside of marriage, sex is prescribed within marriage, right? So that is, in addition to gatekeeping until the relationship is serious enough, marriage, and I'll argue serious relationships, also have sexual obligations. And Deb Umberson and a colleague did some work about this in older couples. Men and women alike believe that it's better for your relationship if you have sex. For women, men want sex. In order to stay in a happy relationship, you should have sex with your husband. In fact, when I had a baby, I was reading this book, like, I don't know, my first baby, like, it's not what to do when you're expecting, but it's like what to expect after you have the baby. And it was written by a woman, and it literally said in there, you better have sex with your husband, otherwise he'll be having sex with someone else. And I will never, ever forget that. So I don't know if I could dig that up, but wow, huh? So even immediately after having a baby, apparently 6 days after having a baby, you owe your male partner sex. And in fact, I think this is just so well established that good relationships entail sexual obligations regardless of desire. And this probably goes in both directions, right? There's mismatches in desire on this temporal level. I assume in every relationship, it's so ingrained in us that of course you should have sex, that like normal people, not academics, like you don't even understand what I'm talking about. Like, well, of course, good relationships entail sex. You have to have sex. Of course, women need to keep having sex with their husbands, even if they stop desiring sex as they go through menopause. You're going to lose your husband. Like, it's so ingrained in us that I think we can't even really see it. But historically, even at the beginning of relationships and even among young people, marriage wasn't marriage, right, until it was consummated. So a marriage didn't even exist if you did not have sex. And so marriage was an agreement to have sex and produce children. Yeah, so here I wrote it down. There was no such thing as marital rape until 1993, when marital rape became a crime in all 50 states. So gatekeeping means holding out until your relationship is serious enough and then giving in because it's your obligation. So did women expect to have unwanted sex? And here's where we get to sexual scripts. Sexual scripts are all about expectations, right? So the expectations for how sexual life and in a specific sexual encounter will unfold. And don't know why I put this line in here. In what kind of relationships did women expect to have unwanted sex? And so here, this is a fixed effects model with a categorical dependent variable of expectations. This is a lot on this slide, so I'm going to walk through it. So what this is the predicted probability of being in each category by relationship type. And so I've got the most serious relationships colored the lightest. So what is the probability of being in this unlikely to have unwanted sex category if you're married? It's 5%. But what is the probability of being in the unlikely to have unwanted sex category if you are in a hookup relationship? 44%. This extreme slope here and the extreme slope here. Married women expected to have unwanted sex. Women in hookups or casual relationships did not expect unwanted sex. And in the middle, it's in the middle, right? So you mostly see this difference at the unlikely end and the certain end. So 58% of women who were married thought it was certain that they would have unwanted sex in the upcoming year. Maybe that goes back to like, we're just so used to, of course they will have unwanted sex I mean, and I'm not even really saying that unwanted sex is bad. I guess I'm kind of questioning how we all came to believe this idea, but I'm not saying that you shouldn't have unwanted, you shouldn't ever have sex when you don't really feel like it. Okay, so how do those expectations affect women's experiences? So does that expectation affect whether they have unwanted sex, and what does that unwanted sex look like? So did women expect to have unwanted sex in their more serious relationships? And so let me tell you about Shelby. I asked her, she's in a serious relationship with this guy, 2 kids already, another baby. I think I think she was pregnant in the very early stages, but she wasn't, or no, she wasn't pregnant. She had had a miscarriage or something. By the time I got to her, she was not pregnant. She doesn't want more kids. And I asked her if she uses any kind of contraception, and she said no. And so we talked about why not. And we were specifically talking about condoms. And she said, well, I'm not usually in the right mind to use condoms because when we have sex, I'm usually already in bed, asleep. He gets on top of me and does his thing. And she went on to describe this as their sexual routine. She's like, well, one time I said no, but then I felt bad. So I went downstairs and I like rubbed up on him, and then we ended up having sex. So she was an interesting example of like, this was their routine, but she also contributed to this routine. And so it's like a vicious circle. But so that's more what I think of unwanted sex in serious relationships looking like. But what about the what about the less serious relationships when women didn't expect to have unwanted sex? Did they have unexpected unwanted sex? And so there was this very strong pattern in the data set where women talked about their first sexual experiences. So Megan was 14 when she first had penile-vaginal sex in this relationship that mainly took place over the phone at a time when they both just randomly happened to be at her cousin's house. She said, it happened. I didn't like it. I told myself I didn't want to do that anymore. And then when I don't think it was me, when the interviewer asked if she had wanted to have sex before it happened, she said, not really. I wasn't really thinking about it. It was just spur of the moment. So unexpected, unwanted. Amy, when she described her first penile-vaginal sex with her first partner, was a neighbor who she had spent little time with, but they ended up having sex a couple times. She said it just happened. And then again, when the interviewer asked, well, before you had sex, did you want to have sex? And she said, not really, but he put the pressure on. So Kelly, and her first sex, it was a one-time situation, and she said, I felt pretty pushed into it. Leslie, her first sex happened in an off and on or whatever relationship, and she said, I wasn't 100% sure about it, but I did it just because. So I could go on and on. Describing their first sexual experience, women really describe the lack of agency. So this lack of expectation that you might have to have unwanted sex puts them in this situation where they're not expecting it and they get talked into it or pushed into it or like just happens. Okay, so this showed up in the latent class analysis. 19% of the sex was undesired or low desire, low expectations, and it was in less serious relationships. So this sort of latent class analysis bore this out. It was 3,350 weeks. You'll see desire for sex. It's coded red because it's much lower than the other two categories. Expectations for sex were not in the certain category and were more likely to be in the other categories. They were in the least serious relationships much more frequently than the other kinds of sex. They were in the most serious relationships much less frequently than the other kinds of sex. And it tend to happen in the beginning or in short-term relationships and not in long-term relationships. So like everything in those stories really was kind of borne out also by the latent class analysis. So my last thing I'll tell you, how do these expectations about sexual obligations affect how we make meaning out of sex or how we interpret our sexual experiences? So the question is rape contextual, because I've told you some stories that don't sound like consensual sex. So let's compare them. I told you about Samantha, who's the one who said, you're wrong after, in the context of being hit. Shelby, the one who said, I'm already in bed asleep. He gets on top of me and does his thing. And So Samantha is an example in a serious relationship of some conflict or some resistance, right? Whereas Shelby is at the other end of the conflict spectrum, in a serious relationship, but basically asleep. So what about women in non-relationships or very nascent relationships? What about the ones who put up some resistance or had some conflict? And what about the ones who were basically asleep? So Sarah was a person on a first date with someone, and he came back to drop her off at her apartment, and he came in and he pressured her into giving him oral sex, and she agreed because she didn't want him to rape her. So and she was raped again by another brand new partner. Sarah, sorry, that was Sarah. Brandy was raped by a friend, and she said he starts pushing things and saying, if you really love me, you'll do this. And I kept saying no and no, and then things went too far. There were two other women who, one, Alicia, who was pregnant, not by this partner though, but she was telling me about a past experience when she was fondled, and she didn't go into great detail, while she slept by someone at a party, and she did not know the guy's name. And Danielle got pregnant while she was intoxicated and unconscious with someone she had known for 3 weeks. So what are the differences here, right? So these are women who are basically asleep. Alicia was literally sleeping. Danielle was unconscious from being too drunk, and Shelby is basically asleep. In terms of women who resisted or experienced conflict in this situation, there's Samantha, who's in a serious relationship. There's Sarah, who cried and asked this guy to stop, and Brandy, who kept saying no and no. And so this, by everyone involved, Samantha, Shelby, maybe even me, gets coded as obligatory sex. These non-relationship experiences get coded as rape. Right. So when you're in a very serious relationship and you have non-consensual sex, even Samantha herself, she's like, well, that's why we wanted to have sex. Makeup sex, right? Unwanted sex doesn't get coded as rape. Shelby did not code those experiences as non-consensual, but she's basically asleep. And yet these women were much more forceful in their descriptions of these experiences as rape. So, yes. Women expected that serious relationships would oblige them to have unwanted sex. Women had unwanted sex in their relationship, in both types of relationships, but in their less serious relationships, it was largely unexpected. And if women did have unwanted sex, they were unlikely to interpret it as rape in a serious relationship. So what are my take-home messages? Young women used gatekeeping logic to decide whether and when to have sex. Most sex was not violent, but almost all violence was sexual. Sex was obligatory in serious relationships, and unwanted sex is obligatory in serious relationships, and it's rape in non-serious relationships. So what are my conclusions? I think of this as a situation of structured agency. So I'm describing this as how this scenario of the different types of intimate relationships structure your decision-making. But I also showed you that I think women have some agency. So I think of this as structured agency. Women both desired and had sex in their more marriage-like relationships. But within those same relationships, women also most frequently expected to have unwanted sex. Sexual education, very controversial topic, but it should emphasize this uncontroversial basic fact, I think, that people don't always agree about, whether and when to have sex. They don't agree about whether and when it's the right time to have sex for the first time, but also in ongoing relationships, their desire is not perfectly matched, especially when you consider it temporally, right? So how do we deal with this? Sex ed has nothing to say about this so far, right? But especially if we're concerned about young pregnancy, I found that more than half of the young women who got pregnant during the study period perceived some pregnancy coercion from their partners. So, thinking about what what kind of interventions this points to, negotiation skills are essential, not because men are bad people and women are good people, but because men and women, and I assume in same gender relationships also, people don't always agree on when it is the right time. And their desires do not always match. So negotiation skills, meaning, discussions. So I teach a sex class to undergraduates, and I'm like, hey, goal number one is like, let's talk about sex and let's use the right words, right? Like, let's not call these things cutesy and just get used to talking about it, right? Because we are just not used to talking about sex. And then lastly, this glaring sexual difference. There's structural difference in whether women interpreted unwanted sex as rape. The intimate relation of contexts in which they occurred suggests really to me that those symbolic interactionists are correct, right? Schemas and those scripts smooth out social interactions. They sure do, right? One reason they do is what's been highlighted is because people don't want to embarrass themselves, right? Or they don't want to make other people uncomfortable. But another way they inform us and they smooth out social interactions is they tell young women when their consent is relevant and when it is not relevant. So that's all I have for you. Thank you. Sorry, I talked through your question.